Good evening, everyone. I'm Woah77, and I thought tonight I'd talk with you guys about some things that interest me, and I'd do a voice video instead of a game video tonight. Now, something that always irks me when I'm talking about video games is, well, I like to do, is the conversations revolving around role-playing games. Because when you see RPG, and you're like me and you've been playing tabletop games for a long time, you, well, you expect to have some choices. You expect to have some control. You don't expect for your character to be more or less a faceless goon running around killing things and collecting loot, and that's really all there is to him. So I get irked when games call themselves RPGs and they're really just a vehicle for violence. Sometimes with a great story, but they're not RPGs, you see. Great example of this, one that's still popular many years later, is Skyrim. See, Skyrim, you make your character, and that gives you certain bonuses depending on what race you pick. And you can design your character, and that's all well and good. And then you get set out into the world, and you get to explore, and you get to delve into dungeons, and that's great, and there's all sorts of stories you can go and pursue. But none of those stories really mean much. You don't get any choices in the stories. It's not like you can save this person's life, or you can end it very much. There's only a couple of points in the entire game where you get to make any real choices. And even most of those are sort of tangential, and over here they don't really mean anything. They're, instead of fighting with the blue guys, you fight with the red guys. Well, that's great, but what's the difference? I mean, yes, they explain that there's the Imperials who are the outsiders and the foreign army, and they work with the elves, and that's bad because of reasons. And then you have over here, you've got the Nords, and they're noble warriors, and if you like that, that's cool too, and you can work with them. But the plot's about going and fighting this dragon, and which guys you side with is only meaningful because that's a gateway to fighting the dragon. If you never want to fight the dragon because it's a big game and you can do whatever you want, it never comes up. So, yeah, it's just not much choice. And it's remarkable that you've got games like Skyrim, which, for how big and open it is, doesn't really give you a lot of meaningful choices to impact the world. And then you've got games like Banner Saga, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, where your choices start to mean stuff. Neverwinter Nights. There's a lot of games where what you choose to do affects how the story progresses, and you choose to do things this way, the story goes down a different route. And I'd like to be clear, when I say how the story progresses, I don't mean the ending. Yes, multiple endings can be a signifier of an RPG, and that tends to be a good indicator that you actually have an RPG where you as a player have agency over the story, but that's not necessarily the case. If the story takes a completely different tone because of the choices that you make, that too can make it an RPG. Mass Effect 3 would be an example where no matter what you did, Shepard dies at the end of the game. Well, you can't avoid it. But that doesn't make it not an RPG. Just because Shepard's going to die doesn't mean that the game doesn't have a story that you can meaningfully impact as you go along. And so I think about this on a regular basis, and I've made many comments before that. I'd like to write a book about the history of role-playing games, the history of video games, and talk about how these genres have evolved. Because you go back and look at old games and go, well, based upon your description, these old RPGs weren't RPGs. And I would go, yeah, you're right. They really didn't have any meaningful player choices. But that's where we start talking about CRPGs. And CRPGs refer to not RPGs in the sense of you have meaningful choices that you can make to impact the story, but classic RPG, which refers to a specific mechanical gameplay. And I will definitely go, there are things with the, like the ARPG, the JRPG, the CRPG. These are all mechanics that they're describing. That doesn't make it an RPG, it makes it a description of the mechanics. This is how the game plays. When you see JRPG, you know it's going to play like Final Fantasy. Just about all of them are going to play exactly the same. You're going to walk around a map, and there's going to be random encounters, and you're going to have a turn order, and you get to select your ability from this menu, and you do your action, and the next guy on the list does his action, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that's how it plays. And that's just all JRPGs pretty much play the exact same way. The mechanics haven't changed much since Final Fantasy 1 and potentially earlier. I'm not sure. I think that Final Fantasy might have been the very, very first JRPG. But if I'm wrong, leave a comment, let me know. I'm happy to be wrong and corrected about things. But JRPGs are mechanics. They generally don't refer to RPGs. You have RPGs. You have like Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, some other games where, depending on what choices you made and what order, would affect the story, and you could make meaningful choices. But not all JRPGs are RPGs. Not all CRPGs are RPGs. Not all ARPGs are RPGs. In fact, while Skyrim would definitely be an ARPG, it makes a shoddy RPG in my book, which is not saying it's a bad game. It's an excellent game. I've loved playing Skyrim. Many other people have enjoyed playing Skyrim. It's a great game, but it's not an RPG. Then again, there are other games which, while I can't say I'm always impressed with them, and I didn't necessarily enjoy playing them myself, are RPGs like Dragon Age, where you have choices and you have control over the story, but it didn't draw me in personally. So, but it's an RPG. That's what I'm getting at, is you have games which are RPGs, but the gameplay may not attract people. Then you have games where the gameplay is really great, but they don't fit my qualifier of an RPG. And you can argue with me about if you agree about this, but I frankly, I don't think that you will have much success with providing me a rational argument as to why my perception of what is and isn't an RPG is wrong. That said, welcome to try. I'm happy to hear your comments about the status of RPGs in the gaming industry. I personally would love to see more games with an actual RPG, that I could consider an RPG. That would make me really happy to see, actually. Another thing that I see people point out is, well, RPG actually refers to the mechanics, and I have a hard time with that, and I will use a proof by negation to characterize why I have a hard time with that. So RPG elements make a game an RPG if you have so many elements. So let's take an example. If having sufficient numbers of RPG elements makes a game an RPG, how many and which ones? Well, off the top of my head, character customization tends to be a pretty high one on the list, at least in terms of gear and equipment, leveling up, character improvement, control over a character. These are key RPG elements here. Oh, that sounds a lot like Borderlands. Now, okay, you might accept the argument that Borderlands is an RPG. I think of it as a very, very well done first-person shooter. It's an excellent game. Great story, great characters, great dialogue. Not an RPG. Does that mean you can't have a first-person shooter RPG? No, but Borderlands isn't one. Well, then what does make an RPG? Well, if it's not RPG elements, which there are a ton, and they're found all throughout the gaming industry these days, it's really hard to find a game that hasn't been touched by RPG elements. Just about any form of gaming that involves attributes, that's an RPG element. That was stolen from, well, actually it was stolen from war games that then made its way into RPGs, but that's a topic for a different video. You have leveling up. That's more of a RPG element. D&D leveling up didn't really exist before RPGs. War games doesn't. As far as I know, this is another thing you can correct me with, but generally speaking, miniatures don't level up. You bring your guys to a battle, you guys fight it out, and then afterwards, when you come to the next battle, it's not like anybody who survived from the battle, will they carry over experience. As far as I know, generally speaking, infantry in your various miniatures battles don't carry over experience. Maybe there are some. I don't know miniatures that well, so I could be wrong. But generally, miniatures in a war game don't have attributes of experience where they improve over time. That I'm pretty confident about. So that's an RPG element. Randomness. Well, randomness is in every game. If it doesn't have a randomness element, it's chess. Or one of the very simple, basic board games that it's just wits against wits. And most games that are wits against wits are done to death. There's kind of a limit to mechanics that you can have if it's just wits against wits, because anything sufficiently complicated will not make for a balanced game when it's wits against wits. So it has to then involve some randomness, some level of rolling a die, entropy, something that the two players cannot control, or four players, or however many players. And the deck of cards has randomness, the order of the deck that's presumably random. I'm an engineering student, and in the study of probability, it's not 100% random, because cards have to fall in a certain order. What order that is, you don't know that, but it's not actually random because there's a certain amount of physicality to everything, and if you knew enough, you could probably account for it. Not saying that anybody can, that's probably beyond, I'm going off topic, never mind. So randomness being an element of a game is kind of a game element, although it tends to be associated, especially if you start to frame it in dice terms, as an RPG element. Character development, that very much came from RPGs. You didn't really have progressing characters in games before role-playing games. It just didn't exist. I can't think, at least, again, I could be wrong, I can't think of any games where character progression is a core element before RPGs. So if none of these things defines a game as an RPG, well then what does? Well, thinking back to the tabletop scenario, you have a game master and you have players. And the big thing that players get to do is they get to make choices. They get to pick how they're going to handle a situation. Now, obviously, at a tabletop setting, I could be completely out of the box. I can think of a solution that the game master hadn't thought of, none of the other players had thought of, use my abilities in a novel way that kind of stretches the limits of the system, but that's what the game master's there for. Obviously, you can't have that on a computer game because although the underworld people who are making that spiritual successor are trying to do something very similar to this, but you have limits as to what the game engine can handle. You can't build a game that can handle infinite possibilities. There has to be a limitation because you have to code it at some point. You have to be able to tell it when they make a given decision, these are the things that happen. Programming. It's a physical limitation of the software development. Unfortunate, I know, but from what I have understanding about coding, having a truly open world would require levels of simulation that we just don't have. All the computers on the planet couldn't emulate a realistic video game world for you yet. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. But so you can't just give them open options. There has to be choices, though. You have to, as a player, have power over your character and make choices. A game that's kind of the anti-RPG would be BioShock, where they are alluding to during the whole game that you've been pre-programmed and you didn't have a choice to do any of the things that you were doing throughout the game. That those were your mission directives from the get-go, and you didn't actually get a say in what you were doing. And that's an interesting twist. It's sort of the predetermination of video games. It's sort of tongue-in-cheek about the predetermination of video games. And for a lot of games, that's a very accurate way of looking at them, is that you don't really have a choice. You just are given apparent choices, which is my chief complaint about Skyrim, is that you've given a whole lot of options, but they aren't really choices, because none of them interact with each other. There aren't any things where if you get so far in the Dark Brotherhood, that affects how the Thieves Guild's going to work. And it's going to affect the main plot line. It's going to cause a plot twist. It doesn't work like that. They're all very independent things, which, from a game design standpoint, makes sense. If you have things intertwine, more chances for bugs, more chances for development flaws. It's complicated. Making an RPG isn't easy. It's a tall order. That's why a lot of RPGs tend to be more of the CRPG style game, because they limit the world that you're in, and they can then they break them up by chapters so that they can control how many choices you can make before a checkpoint. And then you can't go back and do all other optional things that'll affect the story. You've moved beyond that. Now you're in this part of the story, and when you move to this part of the story, the options the choices you've made here are set in stone. There's no, I'm in an open world, so I'm going to go back there and do it. No, if you make it to the end of this chapter and you haven't done this stuff, the town burns. You can't go back and do things in that town. It's gone. Skyrim, being the exploration game that it is, if they made you do that, then you couldn't explore indefinitely. It kind of knocks a few hundred hours of gameplay right off the top. Sorry. Games like Final Fantasy don't do it because Final Fantasy games are very much made with a story to tell, which takes away from their being an RPG. They're JRPGs. They're really good at being JRPGs. There are very few Final Fantasy games where I will say it was a bad game. There were ones I didn't like as much. That's another matter. Games I don't like and games that I'm saying are bad are different. But just because it's a JRPG doesn't make it a bad game. Just because it's not an RPG doesn't make it a bad game. RPGs are a very niche, narrow genre. I don't think they even appeal to very many players, the actual RPGs like I'm talking about. I kind of wish that we'd stop marketing games that, well, I don't consider an RPG as RPGs, because it's kind of like the complaints you hear about roguelikes. You'll hear people talking about how this is a roguelike and everything's a roguelike. And what they really mean is that every character can only die once and you restart from nothing or close to it every time. And that's not really what a Rogue was. So you're missing it. But, I mean, like, that was part of Rogue, but that doesn't make it like Rogue. A good, like Rogue, a roguelike game, is Dungeons of Dreadmore. Dungeons of Dreadmore was a fabulous roguelike that had the turn-based combat, had procedurally generated dungeons, had multiple levels, had randomness everywhere. But not every game can do that, and sometimes they miscategorize games because they're trying to sell it to you, and I kind of wish that people would just be a little more honest. I love games. I love games with a burning passion. I love playing games. I love talking about games. I love acquiring games. I love looking at games. I love learning about games. I wish that the people who are making the games were honest with me about what they were going to give me, because when you say certain things, I expect certain things, and when you don't deliver them, it grinds my gears. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about role-playing games, and if you enjoyed it, let me know so I can go and make more of these videos. Good night.